That is shocking, first of all, but also agonizing to think that that has been that much time having passed. I mean, Javon, I want to come to you because, I mean, you're his friend. You were on the island on the 4th. You were on a different boat. Do you recall seeing him at all that day?
Yes, ma'am. I did see him when I was out there on the island.
Can you tell me what you saw? Does anything seem strange to you about the difference that people are saying of how he was separated from the group?
No, ma'am. I don't think that Nolan would say, hey, bro, I'm staying with this girl on the island. Y'all go ahead and go back without even bringing it, like not even asking to get his phone back. You know what I mean? I don't think that any of that.
No, ma'am. I don't think Nolan would have said, y'all go ahead. I'm staying here with a girl. That's Javon Williams, Nolan Wells' best friend, rejecting, on camera, the only explanation that circulated publicly since Nolan vanished from a Mississippi island on the 4th of July. For weeks, that explanation was treated as settled. Nolan met a young woman that day, chose to stay behind, and planned to catch another ride home later. Multiple friends gave that same account, separately, in interviews weeks apart. Investigators have never called it false. But Javon isn't offering a guess. He's offering years of watching exactly how Nolan behaved, and one detail he can't get past. The friend he knew wouldn't have stayed without even asking for his phone. He's not alone in that doubt. Nolan's father has said almost the identical thing, independently, in a separate interview of his own. And that phone is where this gets harder to explain. Javon's mother spent the first terrifying night trying to track it down herself, and what she says she found, from conflicting location data to a story about where the phone was that kept shifting, has become one of the most disputed threads in the entire case. None of it proves anyone lied. None of it proves a crime happened. The state's autopsy is finished, and it's sealed. Toxicology hasn't come back. And this week, 3 people were criminally charged, not for anything that happened on that island, but for what they said about it online afterward. So tonight isn't about picking a side. It's about a question nobody's answered yet. How did the people closest to Nolan Wells end up with a completely different picture of that day than everyone else? And which version survives once the sealed evidence finally comes out? If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel is following this case in real time, and there's more to this story breaking every week. Now here's how we got here. For weeks, this was simply the story. The basic timeline was never really in dispute. Records from Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources show the boat carrying Nolan and his friends left the mainland at 9:56 that morning and reached Horn Island by 11:14. Hundreds of people were already out there for the holiday, many of them former classmates who'd made the same trip a dozen times before. Nolan was seen by multiple people throughout the day. Then, sometime between 3 and 4 that afternoon, he was seen for what would become the last confirmed sighting of him on the island. According to every friend who spoke publicly about it, here's what happened next. Nolan had met a young woman that day, someone he didn't know well, and decided on his own to stay behind with her. The plan, as it's been described, was simple. Catch a ride back to the mainland later, on a different boat, once things wound down. It wasn't just one person's account. It was repeated, separately, by multiple members of the group, in interviews given weeks apart. Trayston Shepard said the group left in the late afternoon, believing Nolan had made that choice for himself, and has maintained ever since that everyone in the friend group cooperated fully with investigators. Warren Hudson described a complication that had nothing to do with Nolan at all. Their boat had started taking on water, and a distress call went out that day asking for a tow. Getting the boat back to shore safely, not Nolan's whereabouts, became the priority. At 5:44 that evening, that boat reached the mainland. Nolan wasn't on it. And here's the part that gave this account real weight. It wasn't just something friends told reporters. A Department of Marine Resources police report backs up the basic shape of it. Friends told investigators, on the record, that Nolan was last seen with a woman they didn't recognize, and that he'd chosen to stay behind. That's not a rumor that spread online. That's what's written in the official case file. Even the sheriff overseeing the investigation seemed to treat it as close to settled. Early on, Sheriff John Ledbetter released a statement asking the public to stop spreading unverified information, making clear that speculation wasn't the same thing as evidence. For a while, that was enough. A believable account, repeated consistently, backed by an official document. a case that looked like it was heading toward a quiet, unremarkable conclusion. Then, someone who'd actually known Nolan for years started asking a question nobody else was in a position to ask. Javon Williams wasn't watching this story unfold from the outside. He was on Horn Island that afternoon, on a different boat than Nolan, only because there wasn't room for everyone on the first one. He saw Nolan there, talked to him, and before the boats pulled away that evening, he saw him one last time. That's what makes his account different from everything else in this case so far. This isn't someone reacting to a headline. It's someone who was standing on that beach. Weeks later, sitting for an interview, Javon said what he'd apparently been thinking since the day Nolan went missing. He doesn't believe it. Not the part about the young woman. Not the part about a boat taking on water. The part where Nolan simply chose to stay behind and let his friends leave without him. "I've never known Nolan to stay back while his friends leave," he said. "He's always been a guy where, if he rode with you, he's going to come back with you." It's worth being precise about what that actually is, because it's easy to overstate. Javon isn't claiming he overheard the conversation before the boats left. He isn't saying he watched Nolan make the decision. What he's offering is a pattern, years of it, and one specific detail he keeps coming back to. By the account that circulated publicly, Nolan never even asked anyone for his phone before supposedly deciding to stay. To the person who knew Nolan's habits better than almost anyone alive, that detail alone didn't sit right. There's something else easy to miss in the noise around this case. Javon has said more than once that investigators never actually interviewed him, despite being on the island that day, despite being, by every account, Nolan's closest friend. He said it left him genuinely surprised, watching an investigation move forward without ever including the one person who might understand Nolan's behavior better than anyone else. And he's not alone in his doubt. Nolan's father, Elmore Wansley, has said almost exactly the same thing, in a completely separate interview, with no indication the two men coordinated a word of it. Growing up, he said, there was one household rule that never had exceptions. You don't separate from the people you came with. Two people, two entirely different relationships with Nolan, the same conclusion, reached independently. None of it proves the official story is false. Character evidence isn't eyewitness testimony, and people do surprise the people who love them. But it does mean the version that's been repeated for weeks now has to survive scrutiny from the two people who understood Nolan best. And there's one more thing Javon addressed in that same interview, something that had already been tearing through social media for weeks, and that almost everyone had gotten wrong. While Javon's doubts about the "he stayed behind by choice" story were still spreading, a second piece of media had already been tearing through social media for weeks, and for a while, it looked like it might answer everything on its own. A video, recorded from a boat near the island, showed a tense, heated confrontation happening somewhere in the crowd. When it surfaced, plenty of people watching it, including, publicly, members of the family's legal team, believed the raised voice arguing in the footage belonged to Nolan himself. If that was true, it changed everything. It meant the last known moments before Nolan vanished weren't calm. They were a fight. For a story that had already been built around one unremarkable explanation, a guy staying behind with someone he'd just met, that possibility landed hard. It gave the doubts already forming around Javon's account somewhere to go. Except, according to Javon, that's not what the video shows at all. In that same interview where he challenged the official story, he addressed the clip directly. The voice in that footage, he said, wasn't Nolan's. It belonged to a completely different friend, someone who'd gotten agitated enough that afternoon that his own parents were the ones trying to pull him off the island. The person who originally filmed and posted the clip has said the same thing. The confrontation had nothing to do with Nolan. He wasn't in it, wasn't near it, and by every account gathered since, wasn't even aware it was happening. That's a correction, but it's also something more revealing than that. For weeks, a piece of footage that had nothing to do with Nolan Wells shaped part of the public conversation about what might have happened to him. Not because anyone necessarily lied about it, because an ambiguous clip and a widely shared assumption filled a gap that actual information hadn't filled yet. In a case where almost every detail is contested, that's not a small thing. It's a preview of how much of what everyone knows about this case is really just what people decided to believe first. So if the video wasn't the answer, something else that surfaced around the same stretch of weeks was much harder to wave off. Not a piece of footage open to interpretation, an actual phone, and a night that, the more it's been described, the less it adds up. By that evening, Nolan hadn't called, hadn't texted, and for his mother, Christine, ordinary 4th of July silence had started curdling into something closer to fear.
We are begging, if anyone knows anything, his friends, strangers, please.
She reached out to anyone who might know where her son was, and one of the first calls she made was to the mother of Nolan's best friend, a woman named Tashima. What Tashima did next, and what she says she found, has quietly become one of the most disputed pieces of evidence in this entire case. She started with her own sons, called Javon, hoping he'd heard from Nolan. He hadn't. So she turned to Nolan's phone itself, pulling up his location, then checking his Snapchat activity, expecting both to point her toward the same place. They didn't. The location tracker showed one spot. Snapchat suggested somewhere else entirely. Tashima followed the location data to a house where, she says, a group of people appeared to be hanging out. When she pulled up, the lights were off. She knocked, explained who she was and why she was there, and then she waited. By her own account, it took almost 15 minutes before anyone actually handed her the phone. That alone might not mean much. 15 minutes on a chaotic night in a house full of teenagers who may not have known where anything was. What makes it different is what happened during those 15 minutes. First, she says, someone told her the phone was sitting in a friend's truck. Then that explanation changed. Someone else told her a young woman would bring it out instead. Two different stories about the location of one object inside a single conversation. Tashima has said publicly that it wasn't really the delay that stuck with her afterward. It was the fact that the answer kept moving. If there was truly nothing complicated going on, why did the explanation need to change at all? That question matters more than it might first appear, because that phone isn't just a personal item. It's a timeline, location data, message history, the last digital trace of where Nolan actually was and who he was actually with before he vanished. Which is exactly why, weeks later, an agreed examination of that same phone still hasn't produced a single result the public has been allowed to see. One night, two conflicting answers about where a phone was. And that would not be the last time this case produced two different answers to the same simple question. Before we go further, if you're finding this case as unsettling as we are, drop a comment and let us know which version you believe so far. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think, and it's about to get a lot harder to call. Strip away the interviews and the social media noise, and this case comes down to the same 3-hour window on July 4th, told two completely different ways. Version 1. Sometime after 3 p.m., Nolan meets a young woman he doesn't know well. He tells his friends he's staying. They believe him, and when their own boat starts taking on water not long after, getting back to shore safely becomes the priority. By 5:44 that evening, they're on the mainland, certain Nolan made his own choice and would find his own way home. That version is backed by a police report. Multiple friends have repeated it independently, for weeks. Nobody investigating this case has called it false. Version 2 starts with those same 3 hours, and ends somewhere completely different. In this version, the idea that Nolan calmly agreed to stay behind, without his phone, without a plan to get back that anyone can actually describe, doesn't match a single thing the people closest to him say they've ever known him to do. Not once, according to Javon. Not ever, according to his father. And that same night, when someone finally went looking for that phone, the story about where it was didn't hold steady for even 15 minutes. Both versions can't be fully true. But here's the uncomfortable part. Neither one has been proven false either. That's not a gap in the reporting. It's the actual state of this investigation, a month in. One narrative is built on what people said happened. The other is built on what the people who knew Nolan best insist never would have happened, reinforced by a detail from that same night that still doesn't add up. Both are real. Both remain standing. And the distance between them is exactly why this case hasn't quieted down the way a simple, accidental story usually does. Here's the problem. That distance can't be closed by more interviews, more theories, or more opinions online. Only one thing actually breaks the tie: evidence. And most of it, a month later, still hasn't been shown to the public. None of the competing narratives, the interviews, the theories, none of that actually decides this case. Evidence does. And a month in, most of the evidence that could settle this one way or the other is still not public. Start with the most basic question. How did Nolan actually die? Mississippi's state autopsy was completed at the end of July. The results haven't been released, and under the district attorney's stated policy, they won't be. Not until the findings go before a grand jury. She's said publicly that this isn't unusual for her county. Every death that isn't from natural causes or a routine car accident goes through the same process, whether or not anyone suspects a crime. Toxicology results are still pending too, weeks after authorities said early on that there was no initial indication of drugs or alcohol involved. An assessment made before the lab work that would actually confirm it had even come back. Nolan's family didn't wait for that process. They commissioned their own independent autopsy, performed separately by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell. His findings didn't hand anyone a clean answer either. He could not determine a definitive cause or manner of death, and he noted a real limitation in trying. By the time he examined Nolan's body, certain organs and portions of neck tissue had already been removed during the state's own autopsy, leaving him unable to complete a full independent exam. What he did find, and flagged specifically, was a red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head, something he called inconclusive on its own, but worth further investigation. That single detail is what pulled Nancy Grace into this case publicly. She's been careful to say she isn't calling this a homicide, but she's also said, just as directly, that she doesn't believe this should have been treated as a closed question from the start, not with a mark on the back of a young man's head nobody's explained, and not with key tissue gone before an independent expert ever got the chance to look at it. Then, just this week, one more piece landed. A newly finished independent review, 22 pages, built from photos, video, GPS data, and witness statements, concluded there's still a material gap in the timeline between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the moment his friend's boat is documented leaving the island. It draws no conclusion about what that gap means. It simply says, the gap is real, and it hasn't closed. Investigators, meanwhile, are still requesting original, unedited photos and video from that day. One detail makes that gap even harder to ignore. When Nolan's body was recovered, 2 days after he went missing, it turned up close to where he was last seen alive, not carried off by tide or current, close by. It's why the family's legal team has now brought in outside experts in ocean drift patterns, trying to understand how that's possible if the official theory is right. So that's where the actual evidence stands. Sealed, pending, inconclusive, unreleased. Every version of this story, the friend's account, Javon's doubt, Tashima's night with the phone, is still waiting on the same documents to either confirm it or take it apart. If this channel is how you're keeping up with this case, do two things before this video ends. Hit like, so more people trying to understand what actually happened to Nolan Wells can find it. And make sure notifications are on, because the moment that grand jury moves or that phone data becomes public, we'll have it here first. So here's where this actually stands. Once you strip away every theory and every interview and get down to what's actually been confirmed. Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island on July 4th with a group of friends, and he didn't come home with them. A distress call went out from the water that same afternoon. 2 days later, his body was recovered, close to where he was last seen alive. The state's autopsy is finished. It's sealed, waiting on a grand jury. Toxicology hasn't come back. The examination of his phone hasn't produced a single public result. That's the entire list of things nobody disputes. Everything else, why he stayed, what that 15-minute delay over his phone actually meant, whether that mark on the back of his head means anything at all, what's hiding inside that unexplained gap in the timeline. All of it is still open. No charges have been filed in Nolan's death. No agency has said, publicly, that a crime occurred here. And here's what makes that uncertainty dangerous in a way most cases like this aren't. As of this week, 3 separate people are facing criminal charges for threats made against witnesses connected to this case, not for anything that happened to Nolan, but for what they did to other people while trying to decide, on their own, who was responsible. In at least one of those cases, the charges are federal. Investigators have been blunt about it. Chasing the truth about how Nolan died is not the same thing as deciding from a phone screen who deserves to be punished for it. One is an investigation. The other is a crime of its own. That's the part worth sitting with. A month after a boat pulled away from an island without an 18-year-old on it, the loudest danger left in this case isn't a piece of evidence still sitting in a locker somewhere. It's what happens when people stop waiting for it. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. Whatever the evidence eventually shows, everyone who actually knew him agrees on the same thing. He was the kind of person who came back for the people he cared about. That's the version of him worth holding on to while this plays out, because it is still playing out. When that grand jury convenes, when toxicology comes back, when the gap in that timeline finally gets an explanation instead of a theory, we'll be here for it. Until then, the questions stay open. So does this case.